The crisp autumn air hung heavy with anticipation as the crowd lined the streets for the annual Halloween parade. The day, full of excitement and laughter, seemed like any other celebration of costumes and creativity. The sound of children's laughter, the rustle of leaves underfoot, and the occasional crackle of distant firecrackers filled the air, but beneath the festive atmosphere, a tension stirred, unseen, but palpable. For 16-year-old Sarah, this was her moment. She had spent weeks preparing her costume, meticulously designing each piece, ensuring it would stand out in a crowd of ghosts, witches, and superheroes. She wasn't here just to blend in, she was here to make a statement. Sarah's costume was bold, striking, and unconventional. She wasn't interested in traditional princess or fairy costumes. Instead, she chose something that would spark conversation, an ensemble inspired by a dystopian world, complete with chains, dark makeup, and a look that exuded defiance. To Sarah, this costume wasn't just about Halloween, it was a statement of who she was, a young woman coming into her own, ready to challenge the norms. But to some, it would be seen as something else entirely. Standing on the edge of the crowd, James, Sarah's father, felt the weight of his daughter's rebellious spirit. As a father, he had always been her protector, the one who listened to her frustrations and tried to guide her through life's inevitable challenges. James was calm, measured, a man who preferred peace over conflict. He could see his daughter's fire, her boldness, but he often worried it would lead to trouble. And today, it seemed like it might. In the middle of the parade, as Sarah strutted confidently through the streets, Karen, a middle-aged woman with a stern face and a sharp gaze, watched from the sidelines. She was a member of the Homeowners Association, HOA, in their suburban neighborhood, a self-appointed enforcer of rules, and someone who valued order above all else. She was quick to judge and even quicker to take action when something didn't sit right with her. As Sarah's footsteps echoed through the parade, Karen's eyes narrowed. She didn't like what she saw. The chains, the dark makeup, the aggressive posture, it was everything that went against the pristine, orderly world Karen believed in. To her, this costume wasn't just bold, it was a threat. It didn't belong in her vision of Halloween. And, most importantly, it didn't belong in her neighborhood. Without hesitation, Karen marched toward Sarah, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement. "You need to change," she said, her voice loud enough for others to hear. "That costume is aggressive and inappropriate for a family event like this." Sarah's head whipped around, her eyes flashing with disbelief. She had heard the comments, the whispers about her costume, but she wasn't expecting this, an outright confrontation. "Excuse me," she replied, her voice steady but laced with defiance. James, noticing the exchange, stepped forward. He had seen Karen around the neighborhood before, always quick to voice her opinions, but this was different. This wasn't just a complaint about a lawn ornament or an issue with the property line. This was personal. His daughter was being attacked for her self-expression. "Karen, that's enough," James said, his voice calm but firm. "It's Halloween. Let her be." But Karen wasn't done. She was convinced Sarah's costume was more than just a fashion statement, it was a challenge to authority. "I'll have her removed from the parade," she said, her voice cutting through the air. "It's too much. This kind of behavior has no place here." The words hung in the air like a threat, and the crowd around them seemed to fall silent. Sarah's heart raced as her eyes locked with Karen's. The festive cheer of the Halloween parade, once full of laughter and joy, now felt far away, replaced by an uncomfortable tension. The inciting incident had happened. And from this moment on, there would be no turning back. The air felt thick with tension as Sarah stood her ground, refusing to back down from Karen's harsh judgment. She had spent weeks designing her costume, pouring hours into every detail. The last thing she was going to do was let someone like Karen dictate her expression. But Karen wasn't backing down either. "You need to change that costume, young lady," Karen repeated, her voice icy and sharp, cutting through the crowd. Her eyes narrowed as if she had already passed judgment, her authority firm and unwavering. "This is a family event, not a place for, whatever this is. You're causing a scene." Sarah's gaze shifted to the small crowd gathering around them. Some of the parents looked uncomfortable, their eyes darting between Sarah and Karen, unsure of how to intervene. Others glanced at their children, clearly eager to avoid any potential drama. Sarah's chest tightened. She wasn't afraid of a confrontation, she was used to them, but this felt different. It wasn't just about her costume anymore. It was about control. "I'm not changing," Sarah said, her voice steady but edged with defiance. "This is my costume. If you don't like it, that's your problem, not mine." She stood tall, refusing to shrink under Karen's judgmental stare. Her heart beat a little faster, but she refused to let it show. "Don't make me get the police involved," Karen snapped, her voice louder now. "You're disturbing the parade. I can have you removed immediately." James had been watching from the sidelines, not sure how to approach the situation. He wasn't used to conflict, and he certainly wasn't prepared to witness his daughter face off with an overzealous HOA member. He stepped forward cautiously, hoping to defuse the situation before it escalated any further. He recognized that Karen had a reputation in the neighborhood, one that was built on rules and enforcement. She didn't like things that didn't fit into her neat, orderly world. "Karen, stop," James said, his voice low but firm. He walked toward Sarah, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "This is Halloween. We're supposed to have fun. No one is forcing you to like her costume, but we don't need to make a scene." Karen's eyes flashed with irritation as she turned her gaze to James. "This is exactly why things have gotten out of hand in this neighborhood," she said, her voice tinged with righteous indignation. "No one respects authority anymore. It's time someone stepped in and put an end to this nonsense." "Enough," James said, his tone sharper now. He glanced at Sarah, who stood resolute, her jaw clenched but her eyes filled with frustration. "We're leaving if this is how it's going to be. We're not causing trouble, Karen. Just let us enjoy the parade." But Karen wasn't having it. Her face turned a shade redder, her breath coming in shallow bursts as she struggled to contain her anger. "I don't care if you leave. You're ruining the event. I'm going to report this, and you'll regret not listening to me." The crowd had started to murmur, whispers floating through the air as onlookers tried to make sense of the confrontation. Some people began recording the scene on their phones, eager to capture the drama. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, but she stood her ground. She knew what she was doing, she was standing up for herself. But why did it have to feel so hard? Karen wasn't done yet. "I'll have you thrown out of the parade," she shouted. "You're a disgrace, wearing that ridiculous costume." The words cut deep, but Sarah wasn't about to let her get the best of her. She opened her mouth to speak, but her father cut her off, sensing the tension rise to an unbearable level. "Karen, just leave it alone. It's Halloween. What are we teaching our kids if we can't even let them express themselves?" Karen's eyes flicked toward the other parents in the crowd, gauging their reactions. She could sense that some were starting to side with James, but her pride wouldn't let her back down now. Her hand moved to her phone, and she dialed the local authorities. "I'm calling the cops," Karen said, her words almost a threat. She didn't care who saw or what people thought. She was the one in charge, and no one, especially not a teenager, was going to undermine her sense of order. Sarah clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she fought the urge to yell. How had Halloween, an event meant to be fun and carefree, turned into a battleground over her self-expression? The parade, once filled with laughter and excitement, now felt like a distant memory. Meanwhile, James stood there, caught in the middle of it all. He was a man who avoided confrontation at all costs, always the peacemaker in their family. But seeing his daughter in the crosshairs of Karen's wrath, he knew there was no peace to be found. His mind raced, his protective instincts kicking in. He wanted to protect Sarah, but he also didn't want to escalate the situation further. The truth was, James had always been a little uncomfortable with how Sarah pushed boundaries. He admired her independence, her strength, but he often found himself walking a fine line between support and concern. As the situation spiraled, Sarah felt a wave of anger surge through her. She had always been the one to stand up for herself, especially against authority. But this was different. This wasn't just a random fight. It wasn't just a matter of rebelliousness. This was about her right to be who she was in a world that wanted to box her in. This was about standing tall, no matter what. "I'm not going anywhere," Sarah said, her voice steady, each word like a challenge. "You can call the cops, Karen. I'm not afraid." The tension in the air was palpable. Sarah's heart raced, but her resolve never wavered. She wasn't backing down. Not this time. As the police were called and the crowd began to shift uneasily, Sarah's mind raced, but she refused to let the weight of the situation break her spirit. She wasn't just fighting for her right to wear a costume. She was fighting for her right to exist as she was, unapologetically. Sarah's thoughts drifted briefly to her mother. She could hear her voice in her head, a voice that was often distant, both physically and emotionally. Her mother, a woman who had always been absent during the most important moments of Sarah's life, had left a hole that couldn't be filled. Sarah had learned to stand on her own, to take the reins of her life, because she couldn't count on anyone else. Not even her mother, who had left her to navigate the world without her. Her mother's absence was a constant, and as Sarah faced this confrontation, it felt like one more thing she had to fight for. Her relationship with her mom had always been strained, her mom's indifference contrasting sharply with Sarah's need for connection and approval. Her mother would never have understood her costume. She would have told her to fit in, to be more like the others. But Sarah wasn't like the others. As the crowd began to murmur and Karen's anger reached its peak, Sarah stood resolute. She wasn't just fighting for her costume. She was fighting for the girl she had to become in order to survive in a world that didn't always see her. And she wasn't going to back down. The tension in the air was unbearable, the crowd's murmurs fading into the background as Sarah stood her ground, her heart racing in her chest. She could hear Karen's harsh breathing, a reflection of the intense anger boiling just beneath the surface. James stood close, his hand still resting lightly on Sarah's shoulder, trying to keep the situation from spiraling further. But Karen was beyond reason. She had become consumed by her need to control, to silence Sarah's defiance. Her eyes were wide with fury, her voice now sharp and trembling with rage. "You don't understand. This isn't just about you and your costume. This is about respect, about what's appropriate for this neighborhood, for this parade." Karen's hands trembled, her finger tapping the side of her phone as she waited for the police to pick up. The crowd seemed to part around her, as if everyone instinctively knew something was about to go terribly wrong. Sarah's chest tightened, a flash of fear flickering in her mind, but it quickly gave way to a defiant strength. She wasn't going to back down. "You can't control me," she spat, her voice low but forceful. "You don't get to decide what's appropriate for me, for any of us. This is my choice. This is my Halloween." James, sensing the rising danger in Karen's voice, instinctively took a step closer to Sarah. His protective instincts kicked in, a surge of adrenaline that made him feel both desperate and helpless. But he knew he couldn't let it escalate any further. He had to stop it before it went too far. "Karen, calm down. We don't need the police here," he said, his voice low and measured, a stark contrast to Karen's escalating tone. But Karen wasn't listening. She was beyond reason, her face flushed red with anger, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The words, appropriate, and respect, seemed to blur into one long scream of rage, as if she could control the situation with force, with intimidation. Her eyes darted around the crowd, making sure everyone could see her authority, her power. Then, in a sudden, horrifying moment, Karen's hand moved to her waistband. The crowd froze, a collective gasp filling the air as Karen pulled out a small handgun. The shiny metal gleamed under the harsh sunlight, but the reality of what was happening seemed to catch everyone off guard. No one had expected this, no one had imagined that Karen would go this far. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat, her eyes widening as the gun was aimed, not directly at her, but in her direction. Panic surged through her veins as she instinctively took a step back, but it was too late. A loud crack filled the air, followed by an agonizing moment of stunned silence. The shot echoed down the parade route, sending the crowd into chaos. People screamed and scattered, children clutching their parents in terror, as the parade ground turned into a frenzy of confusion. Sarah felt a sharp, searing pain shoot through her arm, a sensation so intense it felt like it had come from a dream. She gasped, her knees buckling for a moment as she staggered back. Blood trickled down her arm, the realization slowly sinking in, she had been shot. It wasn't life-threatening, but it hurt, more than she had ever imagined pain could feel. James's reaction was immediate. His protective instincts kicked into overdrive, and without thinking, he rushed forward, catching Sarah just before she hit the ground. He lifted her into his arms, his eyes scanning her injury, desperate to make sure she was okay. "Sarah, hold on. Stay with me," he said, his voice a mixture of panic and fear, as he tried to keep her steady. His mind raced, but all he could think about was getting her out of harm's way. "I'm fine, Dad," Sarah managed to say, wincing in pain. But her voice was shaky, betraying the fear that had started to creep into her heart. Her arm burned, but she couldn't let it show, not here, not now. The last thing she wanted was to appear weak, especially in front of Karen. But Karen didn't seem to care. She stood there, her eyes wild with confusion and anger, as if she couldn't understand what had just happened. She was a threat. Karen's voice was high-pitched, almost desperate, as if trying to justify her actions. She was being aggressive. She was going to attack me. James's face twisted with fury, his grip tightening on Sarah. He turned to face Karen, his voice cold and dangerous. "You shot my daughter because of a costume? What the hell is wrong with you?" But Karen's eyes darted frantically, as if she was looking for some kind of validation, some sort of justification for her irrational behavior. She stumbled back, almost as if trying to retreat from the consequences of her own actions, her face now pale. I had no choice," she said weakly, her hands shaking as she lowered the gun, still gripped tightly in her fingers. "She was going to attack me, she was the one who started it." James's voice was like ice, his fury palpable. "You pulled out a weapon in broad daylight at a Halloween parade, Karen. You need to think about what you've done." Behind them, the crowd had started to disperse, but the chaos hadn't fully died down. Some people were still recording on their phones, the sound of sirens slowly building in the distance. The police were on their way, and this was far from over. James's focus was entirely on Sarah now, making sure she was safe, checking her injury and trying to stop the bleeding. He had always been her protector, but this was beyond anything he had prepared for. His thoughts raced as he realized just how deeply his daughter had been affected by Karen's actions, not just physically, but emotionally. Sarah, for her part, didn't cry out in pain. She bit her lip, doing her best to stay composed, but her mind couldn't stop racing. Was this the world she was going to have to fight in? A world where every bit of rebellion, every choice, was met with such violence and hatred? This was no longer just about a costume, it was about control. It was about her identity and her right to stand out in a world that tried to force her into conformity. The police arrived minutes later, their sirens wailing as they stormed into the scene. They immediately began questioning everyone, trying to piece together what had happened, but Karen didn't seem to have a coherent answer. She was in shock, her face pale as she was taken aside for questioning. But it was Sarah who had the final word. Despite the pain in her arm, despite the shock and confusion that clouded her thoughts, she turned to James, meeting his eyes with a calm that belied the chaos of the situation. "I'll be okay, Dad. We're going to be okay." James nodded, holding her close, a protective embrace. But as the police took statements and the crowd slowly thinned, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this incident would mark a turning point in her life. She had fought for her right to express herself, to be who she was, but now it seemed like the world would never let her forget that fight. The sirens wail in the distance as the chaos begins to settle. James cradles Sarah in his arms, his thoughts in a whirlwind as they rush toward the ambulance. The crowd is dissipating, but the damage has already been done. Karen, now in the custody of the police, is too dazed to even protest as they lead her away. No words can take back the gunshot, no words can undo the terror that has just erupted in their lives. Sarah's arm feels like it's on fire, the sharp pain pulsing with every beat of her heart. She's trying to stay strong, but it's hard. She's been through a lot in her life, plenty of emotional scars, but this is different. The physical pain is bad, but it's the emotional toll that weighs heavier on her heart. She never imagined that standing up for herself, wearing a costume that expressed who she was, would lead to something like this. James doesn't say much as they ride to the hospital, his hand gently brushing Sarah's hair, his expression a mix of concern and disbelief. He knows that this incident isn't just about her arm, it's about everything else, the larger issue of what happened here. His heart aches as he watches his daughter, who's always been so strong, sitting in silence. Sarah tries to speak, but the words catch in her throat. She's torn between anger and something else she can't quite place. Her costume wasn't just a piece of cloth, it was a part of her, a representation of everything she's been through, and what she stands for. But now, with her arm throbbing and the image of Karen with that gun seared in her mind, she feels a sickening sense of betrayal. She stood up for herself, and this is the result? Was it worth it? At the hospital, doctors rush in, and they begin working quickly, taking care of her wound, stitching it up with careful precision. James hovers nearby, not speaking, not even looking at anyone, his focus solely on Sarah. The world outside seems so far away, and yet, in the sterile white walls of the hospital, it all feels so close, so real. As the pain in her arm starts to dull, Sarah finds herself staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of everything that just happened. Was this her fault? No, she can't let herself think that. She did nothing wrong, she simply wanted to express herself. She wanted to be seen, not as the daughter of someone else, not as someone who fit into a mold, but as her own person. But now, Karen's actions had turned everything upside down, and Sarah had to face the reality of living in a world where defiance, no matter how small, could lead to violence. The community's reaction to the incident is swift, but not as clear-cut as Sarah expected. The news spreads quickly, like wildfire. Some people sympathize with Sarah, understanding her desire to stand out, to express herself in a world that too often tried to silence individuality. They see Karen as an overzealous authority figure, someone who thought she could dictate what people wear, how they behave, and when it was acceptable to be different. These people rally around Sarah, offering support, even starting a small online petition for her, demanding justice for what happened. Others, however, side with Karen, seeing her as the victim of a reckless teenager who pushed boundaries too far. They argue that Halloween is meant to be fun, not a stage for social rebellion. They claim that Sarah's costume was too provocative, that it didn't belong in a family parade, and that Karen's actions were justified, even though the gunshot was extreme. Sarah's heart aches as she reads these comments, trying not to let them get to her. They're just opinions, she tells herself. But still, they cut deep, and for the first time, she wonders if maybe she was too much, too aggressive, too confrontational. As she lies in the hospital bed, Sarah reflects on the strange and unexpected emotions swirling inside her. She can't help but think about her mother. It's almost ironic how this situation mirrors her relationship with her. Her mother's absence has always been a void in Sarah's life, a gap she's never been able to fill. But the truth is, her mother's absence wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. Her mom was always distant, uninvolved, more concerned with her own life than with Sarah's. And Sarah? She had to learn to fend for herself, to speak up for her own needs, because no one else would. Her mother would have told her to tone it down, to fit in with the expectations, to avoid conflict at all costs. But Sarah had never been able to do that. Even as a little girl, she had always questioned the rules, always found herself pushing back against the limitations imposed by authority figures. Her mother had never understood that. She had always believed in blending in, staying under the radar, avoiding trouble. But Sarah had inherited her father's stubbornness, and her desire to be seen, to make her own mark on the world. This was who she was. Her thoughts drift back to Karen. The woman who felt so entitled to dictate what was appropriate, to impose her beliefs on everyone else. In a way, Karen was just like her mother, too controlling, too rigid, too unwilling to accept difference. But unlike her mother, Karen had gone too far. She had crossed the line from criticism to violence, and that was something Sarah couldn't forget. As the night falls and the hospital quiets down, Sarah feels a mix of empowerment and vulnerability. Yes, she had been shot, but she had stood up for herself, hadn't she? She hadn't backed down, even when it felt like the entire world was telling her she should. She had stood tall, and now, even though her arm was sore and bruised, she felt a strange sense of pride. She had fought for her voice. But it also hurt, deep down, she felt betrayed. Not just by Karen, but by the whole world that seemed to be against her, by the people who couldn't accept her for who she was. James, sitting by her side, finally speaks, his voice soft and caring. "You did nothing wrong, Sarah. Nothing at all." He gently squeezes her hand. "I'm proud of you, you know that." Sarah looks at him, her eyes meeting his for the first time in hours. Her father, always so calm, so level-headed, had never fully understood her rebellious spirit. But in that moment, she saw something in his eyes, something that told her he understood her in a way he hadn't before. She nods, a small smile forming on her lips, despite everything. "I know, Dad," she whispers, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "But sometimes it feels like the world wants to break me." He doesn't answer, but he leans forward, brushing her hair back from her face. And for a moment, they just sit there, in silence, knowing that nothing will ever be the same again. The world may try to break her, but Sarah had learned one thing through it all: she would never be silenced. The soft beeping of the heart monitor and the occasional shuffle of hospital staff were the only sounds in the sterile room. Sarah lay in bed, the pain in her arm now a dull throb beneath the layers of bandages. The world outside felt like a distant memory, but inside the small hospital room, everything had changed. Her mind was still racing, replaying the events of the day, the sound of the gunshot, Karen's wild eyes, the sharp pain that had seared through her arm. She tried to push those thoughts aside, but they lingered, haunting her. James sat in the chair beside her, his eyes fixed on the floor, his hands folded together as if in prayer. The silence between them was heavy, thick with unspoken words, unprocessed emotions. It had been hours since the incident, but he hadn't been able to tear himself away from his daughter's side. Despite everything, despite his own fear and the anger he felt toward Karen, there was something else, something Sarah had always known, even if he had never said it aloud. He had always been there, in his own quiet way, supporting her without fully understanding her. But now, in the wake of this nightmare, there was an understanding between them, a bond forged not by words, but by shared experience. Finally, Sarah broke the silence, her voice soft but firm. "Dad, what happens now?" Her gaze flickered to the door, as if Karen might walk through it at any moment, though she knew better. Karen had been taken into custody, her fate uncertain. The police had been quick to respond, but it wasn't the police who weighed most heavily on Sarah's mind now. It was the question of what to do next. James looked up at her, his face filled with concern. "What do you mean?" His voice was hoarse, as though he hadn't spoken in hours. "I mean, Karen," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. "What happens with her? Am I supposed to just let her go free after everything she did?" James sighed deeply, rubbing his temples as though the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. "You're asking me what to do with her. I can't make that decision for you, sweetheart. You have to decide what feels right." Sarah's thoughts swirled as she stared at the ceiling. Part of her wanted to let it go, to move on from the incident, but she couldn't. She couldn't forget how Karen had pulled that gun, how her life had nearly been torn apart because of a simple costume, a simple act of defiance. Sarah had never been one to back down, but now she found herself facing a moral dilemma. What would justice look like in this situation? Could she press charges against Karen, knowing that her actions had consequences that would ripple through the community? What would the neighbors think? What would they say? "I don't know, Dad," she whispered, her voice fragile. "I don't want to ruin her life, but I don't want her to think she can get away with it either." James leaned forward, his hand gently brushing her hair out of her face. "I don't think you're trying to ruin her life, Sarah. But you deserve to have a voice in what happens. She made a choice that hurt you, and it's not right. You shouldn't have to walk away from that without making sure she understands the consequences." Sarah nodded slowly, trying to process his words. There was truth in them, but the reality of what would come next weighed on her heart. It was one thing to stand up for herself in the face of judgment, but now the stakes were higher. Karen had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. The decision gnawed at her. Could she truly go through with it? Could she take the step that might hurt Karen in ways that couldn't be repaired, or would she walk away, pretending that what happened was just a mistake, a moment of madness? She closed her eyes, as if searching for an answer in the quiet darkness behind her eyelids. She couldn't silence the voice inside her head that screamed for justice. But justice meant something different to her now. It wasn't about revenge, it was about protecting herself, standing up for the right to be who she was. "I think I need to press charges," Sarah said quietly, the decision settling in her chest like a weight she had been carrying for hours. "Not because I want to hurt her, but because I can't let anyone think it's okay to pull a gun on someone just because they don't like their costume. I need to stand up for myself." James looked at her with a mixture of pride and sadness in his eyes. "I understand," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm proud of you, Sarah. You're stronger than I give you credit for." The words hung between them, and in that moment, Sarah knew that her father had finally understood her in a way he never had before. He had always tried to protect her, but now he saw the fire within her, the drive to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. And in return, Sarah understood him more deeply too. He had always been the steady one, the one who kept calm in the face of chaos, but now he was learning how to be more than that. He was learning how to support her in ways that didn't involve controlling her, ways that didn't involve asking her to stay small. He had learned to let her be who she was. As the evening stretched into night, and the hum of the hospital grew quieter, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't the peace she had hoped for, it wasn't a victory, not really, but it was a step toward healing. She had made her decision, and with it, she had taken back control over her life. It wasn't easy, but nothing worth doing ever was. The next day, the charges were filed, and the media caught wind of the story. Sarah's name was on the headlines, but so was Karen's. The neighborhood buzzed with rumors and opinions, but as Sarah sat in the kitchen with her father later that week, everything felt different. She wasn't the same girl who had been terrified by Karen's words at the parade. She wasn't afraid to face the consequences of her actions. "I think we're going to be okay, Dad," Sarah said, her voice steadier than it had been in days. James smiled at her, a warmth in his eyes that made his earlier worry seem like a distant memory. "I know we will. You've taught me something today, Sarah." We're stronger than we think." For the first time in what felt like forever, they both knew they were walking forward together, united by the shared experience of pain, defiance, and growth. It had been a battle, and it wasn't over yet, but in that moment, they found solace in each other's company, knowing that, whatever came next, they would face it side by side. Months passed since the Halloween parade incident, but Sarah still carried the weight of that day with her. Her arm had healed, the physical scars fading into nothing more than faint reminders of the chaos that had unfolded, but the emotional impact lingered. It was a strange feeling, knowing that her life had been forever altered by an act that, in hindsight, seemed so small, a disagreement over a costume, a clash of personalities. But that moment had shattered the illusion of safety she had once taken for granted. She had learned, painfully, that standing up for who you were could come with consequences. She had grown stronger since that day, though. There was no denying that. What had once been a rebellious instinct now felt more like a lifeline. Her voice, her right to exist unapologetically, was a power she no longer hesitated to wield. She had learned not only to stand up for herself but to navigate the complexity of standing up for what was right in a world that didn't always understand her. Her resolve had been tested, and it had held firm. But what scared her now wasn't the fear of confrontation, it was the awareness of how often those in power, those with authority, could bend the world to their will. She knew, with painful clarity, that her fight had only just begun. The world outside her home had shifted too. The community, once a quiet neighborhood where everyone minded their business, had been divided in the aftermath of the shooting. People had picked sides, some supporting Sarah for her bravery, others condemning her for stirring the pot. The headlines in local newspapers had fueled the fire, with people debating whether Karen's actions were justified or whether Sarah was simply a victim of the system, a system that stifled individuality and rewarded conformity. The polarized opinions had sparked debates on social media, on neighborhood forums, and in coffee shops. People were talking, for better or for worse, and those conversations had begun to echo across the wider world. For Sarah, the situation wasn't just about Karen. It had become a conversation about authority and personal freedom, a conversation about the limits of self-expression and the consequences of defying societal expectations. The police had made their arrest, but it wasn't just about legal justice, it was about a larger reckoning with the ways in which society shaped its people, often stifling individuality in the process. And while Karen's actions had been extreme, they had brought something to light that Sarah couldn't ignore. The world would always try to box her in, to tell her who she was supposed to be. But she had learned that she was the one who got to decide that. In the weeks that followed, Sarah found herself becoming a voice in her community. She didn't expect it, nor did she want it, but it seemed that the ripple effect of her confrontation with Karen had ignited a shift. People started reaching out to her, wanting to talk about their own experiences, about how they too felt pressured to conform, to stay quiet, to follow the rules. Sarah had always been outspoken, but now, she realized that her voice had power. The message wasn't just about standing up for herself, it was about empowering others to do the same. James, too, had grown since that day. He had always been the quiet, steady presence in Sarah's life, the father who tried his best to understand her, but that moment in the hospital had changed him. He had never fully understood Sarah's rebellious spirit, her need to challenge authority, but in the wake of the incident, he saw things differently. He saw the fire in her, the drive to be herself no matter the cost. And it made him proud, prouder than he'd ever been before. He realized that he didn't need to protect her from every conflict. Sometimes, the best thing he could do was stand by her, support her choices, and let her navigate her own battles. Sarah's relationship with her mother, however, remained unchanged. Her mother never understood what had happened, dismissing it as just another teenage tantrum, a byproduct of Sarah's overactive imagination. Sarah had learned to stop seeking her mother's approval. She had come to accept that her mother would never be the person to understand her, and that was okay. She had her father. And she had herself. Looking ahead, Sarah knew the challenges weren't over. She would face more fights, more battles with authority, more struggles to maintain her sense of self in a world that seemed determined to categorize her. But she also knew that she was ready. The girl who had stood firm in the face of Karen's fury, the girl who had fought not just for her costume but for her right to exist unapologetically, had grown into someone strong, someone unafraid of the world around her. She had found her voice, and she was never going to lose it again. And as Sarah walked out of her front door one chilly autumn morning, her gaze sweeping across the neighborhood she had once felt so alienated from, she couldn't help but smile. The world had changed that day, and she had changed with it. If Sarah's story resonated with you, don't stay silent. Stand up for yourself and embrace your individuality, no matter what. Whether it's your voice, your style, or your beliefs, you have the right to express who you truly are. Share this story with others who need the courage to stand tall and embrace their uniqueness. Let's create a world where we celebrate differences, not suppress them. Stay true to yourself, and never back down. #BeYourself, #stand up for what you believe, #express yourself.